Welcome to History Before Bed. Tonight, we bring you a soothing journey through the pages of classical Greek history. We hope to lull you to sleep as you relax and settle in. Chapter 1: The Dawn of Democracy. The early morning sun cast a soft golden light over Athens, illuminating the vast expanse of the agora. The marketplace, the heart of the city, was already teeming with life. Merchants hawked their goods, from fragrant olive oils to freshly cut marble, while citizens from all walks of life, artisans, farmers, soldiers, and philosophers, gathered in small clusters, discussing the events of the day. The air was thick with the scent of baked bread, sea salt, and the earthy smell of the clay pots that lined many of the stalls. Nikos, a tall and imposing figure, made his way through the crowded streets of the agora. His chiton, finely woven and draped with precision, marked him as a man of importance. As a nobleman and reformer, Nikos was well known in Athens, though not always revered. In recent years, he had led a movement that reshaped the very structure of the city's government. After years of unrest, Athens had finally turned away from the rule of tyrants and toward something new: democracy. Nikos had seen to that. The chatter of the marketplace was filled with lively debate. Groups of men huddled together, gesticulating wildly, their voices rising and falling as they argued over the latest decisions made by the assembly. For the first time, ordinary citizens had a say in how their city was governed. Nikos took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension as he surveyed the scene. This was what he had envisioned: Athens alive with ideas, with the voices of its people shaping its future. As Nikos approached the center of the agora, he caught sight of Solon, an elderly man seated on a stone bench beneath the shade of an olive tree. Solon's beard, long and streaked with white, matched the folds of his simple yet dignified robes. His eyes, though softened by age, still sparkled with the sharpness of a man who had lived through many changes in Athens. He had been a lawgiver in his time, and his wisdom was sought after by many. "Nikos," Solon greeted, his voice steady but quiet. "You have done well, my friend. The city has been transformed." Nikos bowed his head slightly, out of respect. "It is the people who have transformed it, Solon. I merely gave them the tools." Solon nodded, a slow and deliberate gesture. "True, but tools can be misused. Democracy is a delicate thing, as you know. It must be nurtured, protected." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the bustling scene before them. The energy in the agora was palpable, the excitement of a city that had finally found its voice. But with that excitement came uncertainty. Nikos could feel it, a subtle tension that lurked beneath the surface. The people were enthusiastic, yes, but they were also new to this responsibility. Could they handle it? Would they? "The assembly is already divided," Nikos said after a moment. "Some factions are pushing for more power, others for less. There are those who feel that this is too much freedom for the common man." Solon chuckled softly, a sound more of understanding than amusement. "That has always been the fear, hasn't it? That the people, given too much power, will destroy themselves. But they must learn. Democracy is not something given, it is something earned through practice and patience." Nikos looked down at the stone beneath his sandals, worn smooth by countless footsteps. He knew Solon was right, yet the weight of his reforms pressed heavily on him. He had changed Athens forever, but he knew that change was fragile. The system he had introduced was far from perfect. It was vulnerable to corruption, to demagogues who might twist the people's will to their own ends. "I fear that our enemies, both within and without, will exploit our weaknesses," Nikos said quietly. "Athens is surrounded by those who would see us fail." Solon's eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "There will always be those who seek to undo what has been built, but it is the people who must be vigilant. Teach them well, Nikos. The future of Athens depends on it." The two men sat in silence again, the hum of the agora filling the space between them. Around them, the city of Athens continued to thrive, its citizens passionately engaging in the debates that would shape their future. For now, democracy had taken root in the soil of the city, but whether it would flourish or wither remained to be seen. Nikos stood, offering a hand to help Solon rise from his seat. "We have much work ahead of us," he said, his voice firmer now, as if the conversation had renewed his resolve. Solon smiled, his eyes twinkling with a wisdom that seemed to stretch beyond the years. "Indeed, but the first step has been taken, and that is always the hardest." Together they walked through the agora, the sounds of Athens, its voices, its hopes, and its fears, swirling around them. Democracy had been born, but its future was uncertain. For Nikos, the journey had only just begun. Chapter 2: The Persian Threat. The sky stretched endlessly over the plain of Marathon, a deep and cloudless blue that seemed at odds with the grim anticipation hanging in the air. The ground beneath Lycos's feet was firm, the grasses whispering softly in the breeze, but he barely noticed. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sea shimmered in the distance. Beyond the gentle rise of the dunes, the vast Persian fleet was anchored, its ships packed with warriors who had come to crush Athens. Lycos, a seasoned general, stood tall and silent, his armor gleaming in the sunlight. The bronze plates, polished to a shine, weighed heavily on his shoulders, though he had long grown accustomed to the burden. His helm rested on his forearm as he surveyed the battlefield, a simple stretch of land that would soon be drenched in blood. The Persian threat had been looming for years. Ever since Darius I had set his eyes on Greece, and now it had come to a head here, on this unremarkable plain. Around him, the Athenian army was preparing for the battle. There were no grand formations, no impressive displays of military might. The men gathered were farmers, potters, blacksmiths, citizens who had taken up arms to defend their city-state. Lycos knew each of them, if not by name, then by face. They were not soldiers by trade, but they were Athenian, and that was enough. They had pride, and most importantly, they had something to fight for. The Persians, by contrast, were many. Their numbers seemed endless, a sea of warriors who had crossed the Aegean with one goal in mind: the destruction of Athens. They were well equipped, their armor gleaming with wealth, their banners fluttering in the breeze like ominous warnings. Lycos could feel the tension in his men as they watched the enemy disembark. Despite their courage, there was no denying the fear that gripped them. The odds were against them. At the edge of the camp, Lycos caught sight of Miltiades, another general, who had been instrumental in rallying the Athenians to resist the Persian advance. Miltiades' face was set in a grim mask of concentration, but when he noticed Lycos, he offered a curt nod. There was no need for words between the two men. They both knew what lay ahead. Lycos turned his attention back to the army, walking slowly through the ranks. The men were sharpening their spears, adjusting their shields, some offering quiet prayers to the gods. The tension was palpable, the silence heavier than the clamor of battle would soon be. He stopped in front of one of the youngest soldiers, barely more than a boy, who fumbled nervously with the straps of his helmet. "Steady your hand," Lycos said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "Fear is natural. Use it. It will sharpen your instincts." The boy looked up, eyes wide, and nodded quickly. Lycos moved on, knowing that the words were little more than a salve for nerves. But sometimes that was all a man needed, to believe that courage was within him, waiting to be called upon. The sun had climbed higher in the sky by the time Lycos took his place at the front of the Athenian line. Miltiades was there beside him, his expression unreadable as he scanned the distant enemy. The Persians were assembling in vast numbers, their spearmen forming a wall of glittering bronze. It was a sight that could unsettle even the bravest warrior. "We cannot let them advance," Miltiades said, his voice low. "If they reach Athens, it will be over." Lycos nodded. The Persian army was like a tidal wave, ready to crash over the city and sweep away everything in its path. But they would stand firm. They had to. The Athenians would not let their city fall without a fight. He could see the other Greek allies, a smaller contingent from Plataea, standing resolutely at the flank. It was a slim force, but it was all they had. The Persian war horn sounded, a deep and resonant note that echoed across the plain. Lycos felt the tremor of it in his chest. The ground seemed to shake as the massive army began its march toward them. The Athenians, vastly outnumbered, gripped their spears tighter, their shields forming a solid wall as they braced for the onslaught. There would be no retreat. The time for strategy had passed. Now, it was all about resolve. Lycos raised his spear, signaling the charge. The Athenian line surged forward, moving as one, their battle cries rising to meet the Persians. The clash was immediate and brutal. Spears met shields with the crack of metal on wood, the shrieks of the wounded mixing with the roar of battle. The sheer weight of the Persian army pressed against the Greeks, forcing them back step by step. But Lycos had planned for this. As the Persian center pushed forward, the Athenian flanks circled around, enveloping the invaders in a deadly pincer. The Persian ranks, so vast and disorganized, struggled to maintain their cohesion. The Greeks, smaller in number but fiercely disciplined, struck with precision, using the terrain to their advantage. Lycos fought at the front, his spear darting forward like a viper, felling enemy after enemy. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the dust and blood of the battlefield, but he did not falter. The tide of the battle began to turn. The Persians, unused to such fierce resistance, wavered. Their commanders shouted in vain, trying to rally their troops, but the Athenians pressed harder, refusing to yield. The once invincible army of Darius I, the empire that had conquered lands far and wide, found itself retreating in the face of a ragtag Greek force. Hours passed in a blur of chaos, the sound of clashing metal and cries of the wounded filling the air. But when the dust finally settled, the Athenians stood victorious. The Persian army, broken and defeated, was fleeing toward their ships, scrambling to escape the unexpected defeat. Lycos, panting and bloodied, stood amidst the fallen, his chest heaving with exertion. Around him, the men began to cheer, a sound of triumph that rose from deep within their souls. The Battle of Marathon was over. Against all odds, Athens had prevailed. Lycos wiped the blood from his brow and looked toward the distant ships, now retreating back to the sea. He knew this was only the beginning. The Persians would return. But for now, the city-state of Athens could breathe freely, its future secure for the time being. Miltiades appeared at his side, his face still grim despite the victory. "This will not be the last we see of them," he said quietly. "No," Lycos agreed, "but today we have shown them that Athens will not fall so easily." They stood together on the blood-stained plain, watching as the Persian fleet sailed away. The threat had not been eliminated, but Athens had won a momentous victory. And in the hearts of the men who had fought, a new pride was born. Pride in their city, in their freedom, and in the resilience that had seen them through one of the greatest challenges they had ever faced. Chapter 3. The Heroism of Thermopylae. The narrow pass of Thermopylae lay like a jagged scar between the mountains and the sea. Cliffs rose sharply on one side, their steep faces casting long shadows over the rocky ground, while the restless Aegean lapped against the shore on the other. The path between them was treacherously narrow, barely wide enough for two carts to pass side by side. It was here, in this unforgiving landscape, that King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 warriors stood, waiting for the storm. Leonidas, his weathered face set in the stern expression of a seasoned warrior, stood at the head of his men. His armor was simple but immaculate, the red of his Spartan cloak bright against the dust-covered bronze plates. Around him, the 300 Spartans, his finest soldiers, stood in disciplined silence, their spears glinting in the early morning light. Behind them, a few thousand Greek allies from various city-states gathered, but it was the Spartans who would bear the brunt of the coming battle. The Persian army, vast and seemingly without end, stretched across the plain beyond the pass. Their banners fluttered in the distance, a sea of colors and symbols, and the earth trembled with the weight of their numbers. It was said that Xerxes, the Persian king, had brought hundreds of thousands of men to Greece, determined to succeed where his father Darius had failed. The Athenians had defied him once at Marathon, but now Xerxes would crush them all. Athens, Sparta, and the rest of Greece, beneath the might of his empire. Leonidas had known, from the moment he had left Sparta, that this battle would be his last. The oracle at Delphi had foretold it. The words of the priestess had echoed in his mind. Either a Spartan king must fall, or all of Greece would perish. Leonidas had chosen to die. The Spartans were not here for glory, nor even for victory. They were here to delay the Persians, to hold the pass long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare. It was a simple strategy, but in its simplicity lay its brilliance. If the Persians could not break through Thermopylae, they could not march south. The narrowness of the pass neutralized their overwhelming numbers, forcing them to fight in close quarters where the Spartan phalanx was nearly invincible. The sun climbed higher, casting a golden light over the landscape. As Leonidas watched the Persian army approach, he glanced at his men. There was no fear in their eyes, only the calm resolve of soldiers who had been trained from birth to fight and to die. This was the Spartan way. Discipline, duty, and sacrifice were the cornerstones of their society. In Sparta, a man's life was not his own. It belonged to the city, to the state. To die for Sparta was the greatest honor, and here at Thermopylae, Leonidas and his men would earn that honor. The Persian advance began with the rumble of drums, a deep and rhythmic pounding that reverberated through the pass. Waves of soldiers marched forward, their spears and shields glistening in the sunlight, their banners snapping in the wind. From his vantage point, Leonidas could see the sheer magnitude of the Persian force. They poured into the narrow pass like a river of bronze and iron, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the small Greek force. But the Spartans held their ground. As the Persians surged forward, the Spartans formed their legendary phalanx, a wall of bronze shields, locked together so tightly that not even the wind could pass between them. The Spartan spears thrust forward with deadly precision, finding gaps in the Persian armor. felling enemy after enemy. Despite the overwhelming numbers, the Persians struggled to break through. The narrowness of the pass worked to the Spartans' advantage, bottling the Persian forces and forcing them into a brutal, grinding melee. For 2 days, the Spartans and their allies repelled wave after wave of Persian attacks. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with the sound of clashing metal and the cries of the wounded. The Spartans fought with an intensity born of their militaristic upbringing. Every strike, every thrust was measured and precise. They fought as one, their movements synchronized as if they were a single entity. Leonidas, at the center of the phalanx, moved like a lion among wolves. His spear flashed in the light as he drove it forward, cutting down enemy after enemy. His warriors followed his lead, their discipline never faltering, even as the bodies of their fallen comrades began to pile up around them. They knew they could not win, but they could make the Persians pay dearly for every step. At night, when the fighting subsided, the Spartan camp was eerily quiet. The men sat around their fires, sharpening their weapons in silence, their minds focused on the coming day. There was no talk of retreat, no mention of fear. They had all known what they were signing up for when they followed Leonidas to Thermopylae. Their fate was sealed, and they accepted it with the same stoicism that had been drilled into them from childhood. But on the third day, treachery undid their valiant defense. A local Greek, hoping to win favor with Xerxes, betrayed the Spartans by revealing a hidden path through the mountains that would allow the Persians to outflank the Greek forces. When word of the betrayal reached Leonidas, he knew that the end had come. "Go," he ordered the allied Greek soldiers who had fought alongside the Spartans. "Return to your cities and prepare for what is to come. We will stay and hold the pass." The other Greeks hesitated, unwilling to abandon the Spartans, but Leonidas was insistent. "Our sacrifice will not be in vain. You must live to fight another day." And so the allies withdrew, leaving the 300 Spartans alone to face the might of Persia. Leonidas and his men formed their final line, knowing that there would be no escape. As the Persians closed in, led by Xerxes' elite immortals, the Spartans stood firm, their spears raised, their shields locked. They fought with the ferocity of men who had already accepted their deaths, cutting down Persian after Persian even as they were surrounded. In the end, the Spartans fell. Leonidas, his body pierced by countless arrows, died among his men. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. They had delayed the Persian advance long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare, and their heroism would echo through history. The pass of Thermopylae, once a quiet and forgotten place, was now a symbol of defiance and sacrifice. The Persians marched south, but they marched over the bodies of the bravest warriors Greece had ever known. Chapter 4. The Golden Age of Athens. The city of Athens, radiant beneath the midday sun, sprawled across the landscape like a living tapestry. From the hill of the Acropolis, the city's white marble buildings gleamed, their smooth surfaces reflecting the brilliance of the sky. In the distance, the deep blue waters of the Aegean shimmered in the heat, a constant reminder of the sea power that had allowed Athens to rise to such glory. At the center of it all, towering above the city like a monument to ambition, the Parthenon was being built, Pericles' grand vision slowly taking shape. Pericles, the statesman who had guided Athens to its zenith, stood at the base of the construction site, his arms folded as he watched workers and architects maneuver massive blocks of marble into place. His hair, streaked with silver, fluttered lightly in the breeze, but his eyes were sharp and focused. Though renowned for his oratory and leadership, today his mind was on the Parthenon, the crowning achievement of the city's golden age. Under his guidance, Athens had become the cultural and intellectual heart of Greece, but this structure, dedicated to Athena, the city's patron goddess, would be the physical manifestation of that power. Around Pericles, the city bustled with life. Merchants from across the Aegean peddled their wares in the agora. Artisans shaped clay and metal into finely crafted goods, and philosophers gathered in corners of the marketplace to debate the mysteries of life. Athens thrived, not just in wealth and influence, but in thought. It was a city where ideas flourished as freely as the wind that swept through the narrow streets. Everywhere, the hum of conversation filled the air, citizens discussing the latest decrees from the assembly, or traders haggling over prices. Democracy, after decades of refinement, was now at the heart of Athenian life. But it was not just the walls of the assembly or the agora that echoed with debate. The city's streets themselves had become an arena for a different kind of discussion: philosophy. Walking through the throngs of people, one could often spot Socrates, a middle-aged man with a face roughened by the sun, surrounded by young followers. He had no official title or role in the state, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Socrates' questions, always pointed and probing, made people think. Why do we act as we do? What is the nature of justice? What does it mean to live a good life? On this particular day, as the construction of the Parthenon progressed, Socrates could be seen in the marketplace, engaged in a spirited conversation with a group of young Athenians. His robe hung loosely from his shoulders, and his sandals were dusty from walking. There was something disheveled about him, as though he cared little for the appearance of things, but his words cut through the noise of the crowd like a blade through air. "Tell me," Socrates asked one of the youths before him, his eyes twinkling with mischief, "what is courage?" The boy, caught off guard, stammered, "Well, it is bravery in battle, to face your enemies without fear." Socrates smiled. "And does that mean the man who runs into danger recklessly, without thought, is courageous? Or is courage something more?" The young man paused, furrowing his brow as he tried to think through the question. This was the essence of Socratic dialogue, peeling away the layers of assumption to reach deeper truths. In a city like Athens, where democracy encouraged open debate, Socrates' method of questioning seemed both natural and disruptive. His conversations, often carried out in public spaces, reflected the spirit of Athens itself. A city unafraid to confront complex and uncomfortable ideas. While Socrates questioned the nature of virtue, Pericles worked to elevate Athens' status through its culture and architecture. The Parthenon was just one of many projects that marked this period of extraordinary creativity. Sculptors like Phidias, responsible for the monumental statue of Athena that would soon stand within the temple, brought marble to life with their hands. Artists and playwrights, too, thrived under Pericles' leadership, their works exploring the human condition, the gods, and the state in ways that had never been seen before. Yet, even as Athens flourished, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The city's relationship with its allies and its rivals grew more complicated by the day. Athens, at the head of the Delian League, had amassed great power through its naval dominance. But to some of the other Greek city-states, especially Sparta, Athens had become something more sinister. A growing empire that used its wealth and influence to impose its will. The contrast between Athens and Sparta was stark. Where Athens celebrated intellectual freedom, the arts, and democracy, Sparta was a society built on discipline, obedience, and military prowess. While the Athenians discussed philosophy and built monuments to their greatness, the Spartans trained for war. This underlying rivalry had long been a source of tension, and though the two city-states had cooperated against the Persians, the uneasy peace that followed felt fragile. Pericles was acutely aware of this. He knew that Athens' greatness, however splendid it appeared now, was fragile. The city's democracy was strong, but it was not immune to corruption or strife. And Athens' expansion, both culturally and militarily, had made enemies. The very allies that had once looked to Athens for protection now resented its growing power. To Pericles, the Parthenon was not just a symbol of Athenian greatness, it was a way of securing a legacy. But even he could not predict how long that legacy would endure. As the afternoon sun began to sink, casting long shadows over the city, Pericles walked through the agora, his thoughts heavy with the burden of leadership. Around him, the sounds of Athens' golden age continued. Citizens voting in the assembly, philosophers debating beneath olive trees, and artists crafting the sculptures that would one day line the Parthenon. The city was alive with energy, and yet, in Pericles' mind, the future felt uncertain. For now, Athens stood as the pinnacle of Greek civilization, but he knew that no greatness lasted forever. The wind carried the faint scent of the sea as Pericles turned and gazed once more toward the Acropolis. The Parthenon, though still unfinished, stood proudly against the skyline, a monument to what Athens had achieved. But in its shadow, the city continued to grow and change, and Pericles could only hope that the vision he had worked so hard to create would endure. Chapter 5: The Peloponnesian War. The dark clouds of war gathered over Greece, casting a long shadow across the once vibrant city-states. Athens, with its white marble buildings gleaming under the sun, and Sparta, austere and disciplined, stood at the center of the storm. For decades, tensions had simmered between these two powers, their rivalry growing ever more bitter, until finally, in 431 BCE, the peace that had held the fragile Greek world together shattered. The Peloponnesian War had begun. Pericles, now older and more burdened by the weight of leadership, stood on the Pnyx, gazing out over the city he had spent his life building. Below him, Athens spread out like a jewel, its streets alive with the noise of the agora, its harbors filled with ships. But the grandeur of Athens masked its deepening troubles. The Spartans, with their rigid militaristic society, had long resented Athens' growing influence. To them, the Athenian Empire, with its navy and trade routes spanning the Aegean, represented not freedom, but domination. Athens, in turn, viewed Sparta's iron grip on its allies and its brutal efficiency as the antithesis of the democracy and culture it cherished. When war finally came, it was not with the triumphant cries of a noble cause, but with a heavy sense of inevitability. Pericles had known for years that conflict was coming. The small skirmishes and diplomatic tensions had only been preludes. Now, with war declared, Athens' fate was sealed. From the very beginning, the war was brutal. The Spartans, under their ruthless kings and generals, marched into Athenian territory, laying waste to the farmlands and villages surrounding the city. Athens, protected by its great walls, could not be breached by force, and so Pericles adopted a defensive strategy. His plan was simple: avoid direct confrontation with Sparta's formidable land forces and rely on Athens' superior navy to outlast the enemy. But as the Spartan army ravaged the countryside, the Athenians grew restless, their once prosperous lands burned and ruined. Inside the city, the mood turned grim. Thousands of rural citizens had been forced to flee behind Athens' walls, crowding into the already packed streets. Disease soon followed, and in the second year of the war, a terrible plague struck the city. The sickness swept through the cramped quarters like wildfire, leaving death and despair in its wake. Pericles, ever the steady hand in times of crisis, did what he could to maintain order, but even he could not escape the plague. Weakened by sickness, he passed away in 429 BCE, leaving Athens leaderless and vulnerable. As the war dragged on, the early strategies of restraint gave way to reckless ambition. In Pericles' absence, a new generation of leaders arose, and none was more controversial or captivating than Alcibiades. Tall, handsome, and charismatic, Alcibiades was the embodiment of Athenian confidence, but he was also impulsive and self-serving. To some, he was a brilliant military leader. To others, a dangerous demagogue. He had grown up under the tutelage of Socrates, but where his mentor sought wisdom, Alcibiades craved power. In 415 BCE, Alcibiades convinced the Athenian assembly to embark on a bold and ultimately disastrous expedition to Sicily. The plan was to attack the wealthy city-state of Syracuse, an ally of Sparta, and bring it under Athenian control. Alcibiades promised that such a victory would turn the tide of the war and secure Athenian supremacy once and for all. But the expedition was doomed from the start. Shortly after it began, Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege. His enemies in the city had seized the opportunity to undermine him. Rather than return to face trial, Alcibiades defected to Sparta, offering his services to Athens' bitter enemy. In the years that followed, Alcibiades' betrayal became legendary. He advised the Spartans on how to defeat Athens, even going so far as to suggest they fortify a position at Decelia, deep in Athenian territory, cutting off vital supplies. The once proud Athenian empire began to unravel. The city's navy, once the envy of the Mediterranean, suffered defeat after defeat, while its allies, exhausted by the long years of war, began to defect. Alcibiades, ever the opportunist, would eventually switch sides again, briefly returning to Athens before falling out of favor once more. By 404 BCE, after nearly 3 decades of fighting, Athens stood on the brink of collapse. Its fleet had been destroyed at the Battle of Aegospotami, and with it, Athens' last hope for victory was extinguished. Sparta, with the aid of Persian gold, had built a navy of its own and now blockaded the city. Starvation set in, and the people of Athens, once proud and defiant, were left with no choice but to surrender. The terms of peace were harsh. Athens' walls were torn down, its empire dismantled, and its democracy reduced to a shell of its former self. The once great city, which had stood as the beacon of Greek culture, now lay in ruins, its people broken, its pride shattered. As the dust settled on the Greek world, the true cost of the Peloponnesian War became clear. Greece, once a collection of thriving, competitive city-states, had been devastated by decades of infighting. The war had not only ruined Athens, but weakened all of Greece, leaving it vulnerable to the powers that watched from afar. The unity that had once allowed the Greeks to stand together against Persia was now a distant memory. For Sparta, the war had been a victory, but it was a hollow one. The Spartans, though triumphant, had no vision for the future. Their society, built on the backs of helots and rigid military discipline, could not sustain the mantle of leadership they had wrested from Athens. In time, they too would fade, and with them, the Greece of old would pass into history. The Peloponnesian War was not merely a conflict between two great city-states. It was the beginning of the end for the independence of the Greek world. The once glorious cities of Athens and Sparta would never again reach the heights of their former power. Greece, exhausted and divided, had sown the seeds of its own decline. In the years that followed, the philosophers who had once filled the streets of Athens reflected on the war and its consequences. Socrates, ever the gadfly, would continue to question the wisdom of the city's decisions, though he too would eventually fall victim to the changing tides of Athens' politics. The Golden Age was over, and with it, the dream of a united and thriving Greece. Chapter 6. The Trial of Socrates. The air in Athens was thick with tension as the trial of Socrates unfolded. The city, once the unrivaled jewel of the Greek world, was a shadow of its former self. The Peloponnesian War had left deep scars, buildings lay in ruins, and the people were haunted by memories of plague, siege, and defeat. Athens was struggling to find its footing in a new, diminished world, and with that struggle came a desperate need to assign blame. It was in this uncertain climate that Socrates, the city's most infamous philosopher, was brought to trial. The courthouse, an unadorned stone structure, stood under the ever-watchful gaze of the Acropolis. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling. Hundreds of Athenian citizens, chosen by lot to serve as jurors, filled the benches, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and unease. The crowd buzzed with whispers, exchanging rumors and opinions on the man now standing before them. Socrates, the unassuming figure at the center of the storm, appeared remarkably calm. His face, worn by the years but sharp with thought, betrayed no hint of fear. His simple robes hung loosely from his shoulders, and his eyes, bright and alert, swept over the assembled crowd with the same inquisitive gaze he had used for decades. He had spent his life questioning, challenging, and provoking the people of Athens. Today, it was Athens that questioned him. The charges were clear, yet vague enough to stir public sentiment. Socrates stood accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and disrespecting the gods of the city. His accusers, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, claimed that his teachings had led the younger generation astray, filling their heads with dangerous ideas and undermining the traditional values that had held Athens together. In a city still reeling from the chaos of war and the fall of its democracy, such accusations carried weight. Plato, sitting among the audience, watched his mentor closely. Though only in his late 20s, Plato had already begun to emerge as a philosopher in his own right. But here, in this crowded courtroom, he was a student again, watching, listening, and absorbing every word spoken by Socrates. The young man could feel the hostility in the room, the way the jurors shifted uncomfortably as Socrates rose to address them. This was not a trial about the law. It was a trial about fear, tradition, and the deep-rooted anxiety of a society in decline. When Socrates spoke, his voice was clear and unwavering, carrying across the room with quiet authority. He did not try to defend himself in the usual manner. No pleas for mercy, no attempts to flatter or placate the jurors. Instead, he challenged them, just as he had challenged the citizens of Athens for years. "I am not guilty of the charges brought against me," Socrates began, his tone calm but forceful. "But even if I were, what is it that you fear? That I have taught the young men of Athens to think for themselves, to question the world around them? Is that truly a crime?" The jurors shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward one another. Socrates' manner was disarming. He was not a man of power, nor was he intimidating in appearance. But his words were dangerous. For decades, Socrates had wandered the streets of Athens, engaging in dialogue with anyone willing to listen. He questioned the politicians, the artisans, the poets, anyone who claimed to know something. He stripped away their certainty, revealing the limits of their knowledge, and in doing so, he unsettled the very foundations of Athenian society. Socrates paused, scanning the faces of the jurors. "You fear change," he continued, "but I tell you this, the unexamined life is not worth living. To seek truth, to understand ourselves and our world, that is the greatest calling of a human being. And yet, you accuse me of corrupting the youth for teaching them to seek this understanding." Plato leaned forward in his seat, transfixed by the calm courage of his teacher. Socrates was not merely defending himself, he was defending philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom itself. He spoke not just for himself, but for those who would follow him: Plato, Aristotle, and the generations of thinkers who would carry on his legacy long after this trial was forgotten. Meletus, one of the accusers, stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Socrates, you mock the gods, you question their very existence, and you lead others to do the same. Athens has suffered enough. It is men like you who have brought the city to ruin." Socrates raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild amusement. "Do I mock the gods, Meletus, or do I simply refuse to accept what I do not know? I have never claimed to possess wisdom about the gods, nor have I claimed to teach such things. But if the youth of Athens follow my example, it is because they seek truth, not blasphemy." The tension in the room mounted. The jurors, many of them weary veterans of a city battered by war, were tired of questions. They wanted certainty, order, a return to the old ways. Socrates, with his incessant probing, represented the very chaos they feared. As the trial drew to a close, Socrates made no attempt to curry favor with the jury. Instead, he offered them a stark choice. "If you condemn me, Athens loses a voice that has only ever sought to make her better. I do not fear death, for I do not know what death holds. What I do fear is that you, the people of this great city, will stop questioning, stop seeking the truth. That is the true corruption." The jury's verdict was swift: guilty. The punishment, death by drinking hemlock. Plato sat in stunned silence as the decision was read. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of satisfaction and disbelief. Socrates, as if anticipating the outcome all along, remained impassive. He stood with quiet dignity, his fate sealed, but his spirit unbroken. As the guards led him away, Plato's mind raced, unable to grasp how Athens could so easily condemn its greatest thinker. In the days that followed, Socrates' execution became the talk of the city. Some praised the decision, believing Athens had rid itself of a dangerous influence. Others mourned, understanding that a light had been extinguished. In his final hours, Socrates gathered his closest friends and students in the prison, continuing to discuss philosophy even as the cup of poison was prepared. Plato watched, his heart heavy with grief, as Socrates lifted the cup to his lips. There were no grand gestures, no final pleas. Socrates simply drank the hemlock, his face calm and composed as the poison took effect. As he lay down, his body slowly succumbing, his last words echoed through the room. "Crito," he said softly to one of his friends, "we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt, and do not forget." Socrates' death marked the end of an era in Athens. The city, once the cradle of democracy, art, and philosophy, had turned inward, its people fearful and uncertain of the future. But for Plato, this was not the end. Socrates' teachings, his questions, his relentless pursuit of truth, these would live on. In the years to come, Plato would write and teach, preserving his master's legacy and laying the foundations for what would become Western philosophy. The man who had been condemned for corrupting the youth would, through his students, shape the minds of generations to come. And though Athens had silenced Socrates, his voice would continue to resonate far beyond the walls of the city. Chapter 7. The Rise of Macedon. The palace of Pella stood in stark contrast to the crumbling grandeur of the southern Greek city-states. Set amidst the rolling hills of Macedon, its walls gleamed with new strength, a symbol of the rising power that now cast its shadow over the fragmented Greek world. Inside, King Philip II surveyed a map spread across a massive stone table. His sharp eyes traced the lines marking the borders of once proud cities, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, all weakened, all ripe for conquest. Philip was no ordinary king. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with the air of a man who had seen battle, he was both warrior and diplomat. A man who had united the once fractious and backward kingdom of Macedon into a formidable military power. His right leg bore the scars of wounds suffered in battle, and his left eye, lost to an arrow years earlier, was now replaced by an empty socket that only seemed to add to his fearsome reputation. The Greek city-states had long dismissed Macedon as little more than a barbaric backwater, too disorganized to pose any real threat. But Philip, with his vision and ruthless determination, had changed that. He had revolutionized his army, transforming it into a disciplined and fearsome force. At the heart of this transformation was the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of soldiers armed with sarissas, long spears that extended far beyond the reach of traditional Greek weapons. This innovation, combined with Philip's tactical genius, had allowed him to carve out a vast territory that stretched across northern Greece and beyond. As Philip's gaze lingered on the map, a voice broke the silence behind him. "Father, why do they fight us?" Philip turned to see his son, Alexander, standing in the doorway. The boy, only 16, was already tall for his age, with a restless energy that seemed impossible to contain. His hair, a wild mass of curls, caught the sunlight streaming through the window, and his eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes, were full of curiosity and ambition. Alexander had always been different. Even as a child, he had shown signs of brilliance that set him apart from others his age. His mind was sharp, his thirst for knowledge unquenchable. Philip had ensured that his son received the best education possible, hiring the philosopher Aristotle as his tutor. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander had devoured lessons on philosophy, science, and literature, but it was warfare and conquest that truly captured the boy's imagination. "They fight us," Philip said slowly, his voice low and measured, "because they still believe they are free, but they are not. Athens, Thebes, all of them, they are prisoners of their own pride, trapped in the ruins of a past they refused to leave behind." Alexander approached the table, his eyes scanning the map with the same intensity as his father's. He traced the route Philip's army had taken south through Thessaly into the heart of Greece. He had accompanied Philip on many of these campaigns, learning firsthand the art of war and leadership. But there was something more in Alexander, something that even Philip could see. It wasn't just ambition, it was a hunger, a drive to surpass all that had come before. "Will they ever join us?" Alexander asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "They will have no choice," Philip replied, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Once we break them at Chaeronea, they will understand. They will understand that Macedon is now the true power of Greece." The Battle of Chaeronea, which loomed in the near future, was to be the final test of Philip's ambitions. The combined forces of Athens and Thebes, sworn enemies, but now united in desperation, had risen to challenge Macedon's dominance. For Philip, this battle was not just about territory. It was about ending the old world of independent city-states and establishing a new order, one where Macedon ruled supreme. Days later, the Macedonian army marched south, their footsteps echoing across the plains of Boeotia. At the head of the column rode Philip, his one good eye scanning the horizon. By his side rode Alexander, his face set in grim determination, eager to prove himself. For Alexander, this was more than a battle. It was a chance to show his father and the world what he was capable of. When the two armies met on the field of Chaeronea, the tension was palpable. The Athenians, led by the aging general Demosthenes, and the Thebans, with their famed sacred band at the forefront, prepared to fight for their freedom. But the Macedonians were ready, their phalanx stretching out across the field like an impenetrable wall of spears. Philip, ever the strategist, opened the battle with a feigned retreat on the left flank, drawing the Athenian forces forward in pursuit. The Athenians, thinking they had the upper hand, surged ahead, but it was a trap. As they overextended, Philip's forces wheeled around and launched a devastating counterattack. On the right flank, Alexander led a cavalry charge with all the ferocity of a seasoned commander. His face, youthful yet fierce, was set in grim focus as he drove his men forward, smashing into the Theban lines. The sacred band fought bravely, their resolve legendary, but even they could not withstand the force of Alexander's assault. One by one, the Thebans fell, their famed unity broken by the sheer power of the Macedonian cavalry. By the end of the day, the field was littered with the bodies of Greece's finest warriors. The Athenians and Thebans had been utterly defeated. The Battle of Chaeronea was over, and with it, the era of the independent Greek city-states. Macedon had emerged victorious, its dominance over Greece now unquestionable. In the aftermath of the battle, Philip stood on the blood-soaked field, surveying the destruction. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fallen. His victory was complete, but he knew that it was only the beginning. With Greece under his control, Philip could now turn his attention to an even greater goal, the conquest of the Persian Empire. Beside him, Alexander knelt to examine the body of a fallen Theban soldier. His eyes, once again, were filled with that insatiable hunger. Philip watched him in silence, recognizing in his son the same ambition that had driven him to unite Macedon, but also something more, an unyielding desire to carve out a legacy far greater than his own. "Remember this day, Alexander," Philip said quietly, his voice a mixture of pride and warning. "This is where your destiny begins, but it will not be easy. The world will not bow to you without a fight." Alexander looked up at his father, his face set in determination. "Let them try," he said simply, his voice filled with the confidence of youth. "I will conquer them all." Philip smiled, though there was a flicker of unease in his heart. He had built an empire, but he knew that Alexander had dreams even grander. The boy was already thinking beyond Greece, beyond Macedon. He was thinking of Persia, of Asia, of the world. As they rode back to Pella, the landscape of Greece behind them, the stage was set for the next great chapter in history. Philip had broken the power of the Greek city-states, but it would be Alexander who would carry the torch further, pushing the boundaries of Greek influence beyond anything his father had imagined. The rise of Macedon was complete, and in its wake, a new age was dawning, an age where the son of Philip would lead Greece to conquer the known world. Chapter 8. Alexander the Great's Empire. The city of Babylon, once the heart of the Persian Empire, now stood as the center of a vast and sprawling domain ruled by a single man, Alexander the Great. The grand palaces, adorned with gardens and towering walls, reflected the wealth and power of this ancient city, but its streets, teeming with life from all corners of Alexander's empire, spoke of something new, a fusion of East and West, the birth of a new world order. Alexander, now 32 years old, sat in his chambers, his body weakened by illness, his once vigorous frame now pale and thin. His face, still youthful but marked by years of relentless campaigning, was etched with exhaustion. The years had taken their toll, years spent at the front of his army, conquering lands far beyond what any Greek had ever dreamed possible. From the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt to the lush river valleys of India, Alexander had carved out the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Yet here, in the city of Babylon, his journey was coming to an end. The empire he had built was unlike anything Greece had ever known. After his father, Philip II, was assassinated in 336 BCE, Alexander ascended to the throne of Macedon, a young king with unparalleled ambition. He quickly consolidated his power at home, quelling revolts among the Greek city-states, and then set his sights on Persia, the greatest empire of the ancient world. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with a small but fiercely loyal army, launching what would become one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history. One by one, the great Persian cities fell before him. The Battle of Issus, where Alexander's outnumbered forces crushed Darius III's army, opened the door to the heart of the Persian Empire. In 331 BCE, at the decisive Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander's genius on the battlefield and the disciplined Macedonian phalanx broke the Persian resistance once and for all. Darius fled, and the Persian capital of Persepolis, with its magnificent palaces and vast wealth, lay open to Alexander. As his empire expanded, so too did his vision. Alexander was more than a conqueror. He was a man who sought to blend the cultures of the East and West into a unified whole. He did not seek to destroy the lands he conquered, but to reshape them, spreading Greek culture while adopting many aspects of the civilizations he encountered. He founded cities throughout his empire, the most famous of which, Alexandria in Egypt, would become a center of learning and commerce for centuries to come. In these cities, Greek settlers mingled with local populations, creating a new hybrid culture that would come to define the Hellenistic world. Greek language, art, and philosophy spread throughout the Near East, while Alexander himself adopted Persian customs, wearing the robes of a Persian king and appointing Eastern officials to high positions. To many of his Macedonian soldiers, these gestures were troubling. They feared that Alexander was losing touch with his Greek roots. But to Alexander, they were necessary steps toward his dream of a unified world where East and West were no longer divided. Yet for all his success, Alexander's ambition came at a great cost. His relentless drive to push further, to march beyond Persia, through the mountains of Afghanistan, and into the mysterious lands of India, strained both his army and his own body. The campaign in India was particularly brutal. Though he defeated the powerful King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, the cost was immense. The rains, the unfamiliar terrain, and the fierce resistance of the Indian warriors wore down his troops. When Alexander proposed marching even further east, his soldiers, exhausted and homesick, refused. For the first time, Alexander had to turn back. As they retraced their steps, the army faced a grueling march through the Gedrosian desert, where heat, thirst, and hunger claimed thousands of lives. By the time they reached the safety of Persia,
The once proud army had been decimated, its morale shattered. Alexander's body too began to break down. Years of hard living, countless battles, and the strain of leadership had left him vulnerable. Now, in Babylon, the city he had chosen as his imperial capital, Alexander lay dying. His once brilliant mind, which had conceived of strategies that had conquered the world, now struggled with fever. His generals, the men who had followed him through the mountains, deserts, and rivers of Asia, gathered around his bed, anxious and uncertain. They had shared in his victories, but they also knew that without Alexander, the empire he had built would be impossible to hold together. Alexander's thoughts, in those final days, turned to his vision of the future. He had dreamed not just of an empire ruled by force, but of a world united by culture, commerce, and knowledge. He had invited Persian and Greek nobility to intermarry, held massive banquets that brought together people from all parts of his empire, and spoken of a future where his realm would stretch even further, perhaps to the ends of the earth. But now, as his strength faded, those dreams began to slip away. As the fever worsened, Alexander's generals asked him who would inherit his empire. The room fell silent as they waited for his reply. His words, spoken in a weak, rasping voice, would become the stuff of legend to the strongest. With that, the fate of his empire was sealed. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, his empire stretching from Greece to Egypt, from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. In the years that followed, his generals, the Diadochi, would carve up the empire into separate kingdoms, each ruling a portion of the lands Alexander had conquered. His dream of a unified world crumbled, but the legacy of his conquests lived on. The death of Alexander marked the end of the classical period and the beginning of the Hellenistic Age. Greek culture, carried by the winds of war and the movement of peoples, took root in distant lands. New cities and centers of learning flourished, from Alexandria in Egypt to Seleucia in Mesopotamia. The fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures would shape the history of the Mediterranean and the Near East for centuries, as philosophers, scientists, and artists built upon the foundations laid by Alexander's conquests. Yet for all the grandeur of his empire, the man himself remained a mystery. Some saw him as a hero, a visionary who sought to unite the world. Others viewed him as a tyrant, driven by insatiable ambition. In the end, Alexander was both, a conqueror and a dreamer, a man whose life burned brightly but briefly, leaving behind a world forever changed.